So,
Hey, Lloyd.
Ingrid, do we have the study session agenda? Okay, good evening and welcome everyone to the Brisbane City Council Special Meeting Study Session of May 4th, 2017. Tonight, we are considering the Brisbane Baylands planning applications, Baylands concept plans, Brisbane Baylands specific plan, case SP-01-06, general plan amendment, cases GP-01-06, GP-01-10, and related final environmental impact report. The specific topics this evening include land use, planning, aesthetics, housing and population, and related policy issues, Universal Paragon Corporation applicant. And I will just remind everyone that while this study session is open to the public, the primary purpose is for the City Council to ask questions on the agenda topic, and public comment is encouraged at the 7:30 p.m. public hearing. So we'll begin with questions. Who would like to go first?
I really only got one. I don't have much to ask.
Okay.
Excuse me, Madison. Flip it around this way. There you go. All right. Thank you for the staff report. Actually, almost duplicative of the one out of the EIR framework binder that you had given us. I wanted to ask about the land use framework map that you have. Excuse me. And really, all you have on there is 10 areas identified. This is in the back. It's a page 3. It's on the back of the staff report. This one here. It's in the back. It's on page. It's way in the back.
Okay.
Wait, you got it. Okay. Everybody on it? You got it, Terry?
That's fine. Go ahead. Got it.
There it is. So you have the 10 sub areas, I guess, is what you're looking at, and then some areas aren't really marked, like Brisbane Bayshore, outside of Brisbane Bayview Park. Is that parkland or some area in Icehouse Hills? Is that like open space?
Correct. Yeah.
Identified, but it's not really designated as a sub area. Okay.
Correct. Yeah, the green areas are open space areas that are not identified as potential development areas.
And this is this map is based on what?
This is from the Planning Commission's recommendation.
Planning Commission. Okay. Yeah, I wasn't clear on that. Okay. But areas 7 and 8 on here aren't really studied in the EIR, right?
Correct. Areas 7 and 8 are actually not in the Baylands. 7 is, let's go, just 7. Area 7 is not part of the specific plan, but it is part of the Baylands sub-area, so that's the reason that it's included in the Planning Commission's recommendation.
Okay.
Yeah, and 8 is the Kinder Morgan Tank Farm, which is also not part of the Baylands specific plan application, general plan amendment application, but is part of the Baylands sub-area, so that's the reason the Planning Commission included it in their recommendation.
Okay.
Also, they had looked at what are the key land uses that we're working, or not around, but are determining land use adjacent, so that's the reason they're shown.
Okay. I'm sorry, I missed the cover page. That's why I was, where in the heck? I've never seen this before. So, sorry about that. Thank you. But that clears it up, so.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else?
That's it.
Okay. Madison?
Hi. Briefly, in past discussions that we've had, and also in the Planning Commission binder, the reading that was assigned for today's hearing, it discusses a little bit about phasing. And I'm just curious if the Planning Commission, or what the Planning Commission, what they had recommended in terms of phasing. Because it just kind of talks about, just lightly touches on it. It doesn't really go into a lot of detail in here, like with the DSP. And so I was just curious, like for any other variants or just phasing in general, if we could just go into a little bit more detail about if there is a solid plan for phasing and what that looks like, or is it kind of just up in the air right now based on what land use will be determined?
Well, yeah, the land use that gets determined will, to an extent, look at phasing. There is a phasing plan in the proposed specific plan. The Planning Commission's recommendation related to phasing is to establish a series of performance standards that would be met for each increment of development. So that rather than say, this goes first, this goes second, this goes third, which is what people normally perceive as a phasing plan, Planning Commission's recommendation would say, wherever the first increment of development is, water shall be supplied, sewer standards shall be met, traffic shall be this, parks shall be provided concurrent with that. And the reason for that is I've never seen a large-scale specific plan or a large-scale development of any kind where the actual phasing of development followed the original phasing plan. Mm-hmm. And so what a lot of developments have found is the better way of approaching it is to say each increment of development must meet these requirements and then let the market dictate which goes first. Because in a developer's best judgment, he can say the infrastructure is cheapest and least expensive. I start in this corner of the site, and lo and behold, the first site person who wants to build something on the site is in some other corner, and now the developer has to reckon with what he wants to do. So the Commission's recommendation was give that flexibility to the ultimate development and make sure that all the performance standards are met so that the city can maintain each increment as it occurs.
Okay.
And as a reminder, the Commission's recommendation is not to approve a specific plan or a plan at the same level of the DSP. So again, it's general plan level guidance, and you'll notice in the rest of your general plan, there's no specification within any other sub-area as to phasing of how individual parcels would develop. So it's, from a general plan level, it's quite unique would be very unique to require a very detailed level of phasing. That usually comes as part of the subsequent planning.
Okay. I just remember we had kind of briefly talked about, like, you can't just say, hey, build us a couple of hotels first and, park, because that's not, it has to be economically feasible at every state of development. So to help, continue to finance the rest. So I just wanted to make sure I was on the same page and kind of understood everything correctly. So, okay, thank you.
Okay. Terry?
I had a couple. Is this one on?
Yeah.
Okay. I had a couple questions on the page 2 of the staff report. They have the southerly lagoon is limited to open space and recreation. I was wondering if you could define the specifics of what that is allowed use in that portion.
That is what the general plan says.
Right.
There's not a lot of detail that backs that up in terms of what that means. So open space meaning, would mean in that context, no buildings, no structures, or structures only related to the recreational use. So it would be more park-like than commercial recreation. And recreation would be more public-type recreation than a commercial recreation type of setup. There's not a lot of definition in the general plan of open space or recreation.
Okay, so more public recreation on the lines of a soccer field or a ball, or
We're talking about the area south of the lagoon, right, Lloyd? Is that the area?
The southerly lagoons.
Is that the area that's south of the lagoon then? Because that area has its own sort of limitations with it was restored, and there are very specific limitations in terms of land uses that can occur if that's.
Well, I was reading the definitions that were on page 2, and they have the southerly lagoon area.
The southerly lagoon area is defined as the lagoon itself, as well as the land immediately adjacent. So it'd be bound by Sierra Point Parkway, the rail line, and Lagoon Road. And so it would be the uses in there, which would be the lagoon itself, marshland, and then it's called bayfront, although it doesn't actually front the bay. But there's no definitions in the same way that there's a definition for trade commercial in the general plan.
So south of Lagoon Road, that open space, then there's the lagoon itself, and then the back part of the
Right.
lagoon towards Sierra Point.
Yeah, so there's not a discussion of what does it mean in terms of specific uses.
Okay.
I think that, if I could, that open space is more publicly owned, and then the open area is more privately owned. But there was never a designation of what type of open space or what the uses are. Left that flexibility in.
Correct.
20-something years ago.
Okay. And then also on page 2, when it talks about the existing general plan maximum development density, it states on the last paragraph that that development intensity has been for individual sites, but not for a maximum amount of the Baylands as a whole.
Correct.
But wouldn't that be just a matter of simple math of what the general plan allows right now, of if you've got 5 sites and they each have an intensity level, that plays out to what the general plan allows for the intensity level if you're taking it as a whole?
If we did that and took the maximum development intensity for each parcel and simply did that simple math, you're going to be somewhere up around, if I remember, 18 to 20 million square feet.
Yeah, it's going to be huge.
However, the general plan also says that the anticipated build-out will be far less, and that the anticipated build-out of the general plan is based on meeting traffic standards and LOS standards as they were understood to be in 1994. When you go to the environmental impact report, its assumption is that build-out of the general plan would depend on type of use and traffic generation, and assume somewhere between 1 million square feet if it's retail and commercial, up to 4.2 million square feet if it were built out as more industrial.
So currently, under the general plan, they could build more under the general plan the way it sits, just no housing.
The existing general plan, and this is one of the things we'll talk about in relation to the traffic standards. So traffic standards aside, if we're just looking at the floor area ratios, would allow for more development than is proposed in any of the scenarios. However, when you apply the traffic standard, one of the things that we found is that even without any development in the Baylands, your LOS standards, level of service standards in the general plan, will not be met. Just based on traffic in San Francisco coming out of Daly City, background traffic. So you're left with this, I'll call it dilemma, that says the build-out must meet the LOS, the level of service standard. However, you can't build anything on the Baylands and actually meet that standard.
That's level of service C? Is it? Or
It's C at certain intersections and D at others.
Yeah.
And the ones that I think it's specified as level of service D except at some specified intersections, which are C.
Okay. And then on all of these, we didn't have, I shouldn't say, we didn't have any information on what the Planning Commission recommendation would look like for the view sheds. Did we, those weren't done, those modelings?
No, the Planning Commission recommendation, the way they would lay out is 1 to 2 million square feet would be distributed, if we go back to the exhibit that had been mentioned earlier, would be all to the west side of the site. The land, actually, it would be to the west side of the site, Recology, and south of Recology. Buildings would generally be 2 to 4 stories in height as a maximum, so that there would be effectively no blockage of views of either the bay or the San Bruno Mountain. It would be far less than any of the scenarios that were analyzed.
And the current height of the dirt out there, I'm assuming, is still below the 85 feet limit that we have, although it looks like it's gotten much higher again lately. And all these view sheds on the table, view sheds, are anticipating building on that type of...
On the platform, they're based on the grading plan that was prepared for the developer-sponsored plan, for the developer-sponsored scenarios. Right, would then move dirt from the landfill onto the former rail yard and create, because right now they're like that, so they'd be much more close to each other, and that is what the basis of the grading plan is. Or the view sheds are all based on that grading plan.
And the reason that the developer did a grading plan with that much pile, wouldn't all those buildings have less impact if they were done at current levels of what the original grading was?
Right, but yeah.
At grade level, I should say.
Right, so yeah, if you left the former rail yard down, there would be less impact views looking to the west. What you would also have is the Bayland sitting at 2 very distinct levels, and trying to get roadway connections from west to east would be really difficult.
Why would they be different if they're going to have to take the one side down to get to engineered ground level?
Right. So the landfill comes down, but the rail yard comes up.
Well, that's only saying they're keeping the dirt.
Yeah, it will balance out, yes.
If they were keeping the dirt, but I'm just wondering why they need to keep the dirt.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Cliff?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So, I just want to kind of get my head wrapped around the density, of what potentially could be. So, in the staff report, you talked about or mentioned Sierra Point. So, using Sierra Point as an example. So, on page 15 of the staff report at the footnote, it mentions that Sierra Point has got about 90 acre site, about 90 acres that's been developed, with about close to 700,000 square feet of commercial. But it doesn't mention what the square footage is of the hotel, of the 2 hotels.
You're probably close to nearly 1 million square feet.
Of the sites that have been already developed. Okay, and then you take in the HCP site, which is 540, and another office site that's 445, and then there's also the hotel site. So we're looking at about 2.5 million square feet.
A little over 2, ballpark range.
Okay. And then the Planning Commission's recommendation is to be with the same amount of square footage for the Baylands as for Sierra Point.
Correct. That wasn't really a point of reference for them. That didn't really come up in their discussion, but.
But just to add on to that, it was 1 to 2 million square feet of additional
Of
development.
additional.
So that doesn't include the existing development at the Baylands.
Which is Sierra
That's
Point.
600,000 square feet.
We got 600 there.
So it'd
Okay.
be about,
So it'd be about the same, really,
Yeah.
when you look at it.
right, and by comparison, if we're assuming 2.5 million square feet of building ultimately at Sierra Point on 90 acres, that is a 0.64 floor area ratio. So you get an idea of what 2.4 or 4.8 turn out to be.
Okay. Yeah.
4 to 8 times as dense as Sierra Point.
Yeah, Cliff, if I may, because I had asked staff a couple meetings back to come back with those exact things.
I remember you mentioning that. So yeah, it'd be nice just to kind of get that comparison between the two and how that would look. Let's see.
Mhm.
So, in the Planning Commission's recommendations, it talks about, that the site should be transit-oriented. It talks about the Geneva Avenue extension. Those are big-ticket, expensive items. How feasible is that to have those public transportation infrastructure items in the plan if the development is so low? Is that really is it really feasible economically?
That's really a Kaiser Marston question. But what would happen is, theoretically, the fair share for the Baylands should be related to the amount of development, amount of traffic being thrown at that. But that hasn't, so that's a Kaiser Marston and Randy question, and we can get that question to them. The issue with transit orientation was also density or intensity of the use sitting next to the transit station. And part of the Planning Commission staff report during their deliberations, when we talked about development intensity, did some comparisons to of what 1 to 2 million square feet and what the Planning Commission was recommending in terms of density. That is, the Planning Commission's recommendation of the 1 to 2 million square feet extra is a very suburban, two-story kind of development, not particularly transit-oriented, but very common kind of development you saw in the Bay Area in the 70s and 80s. Now being supplanted by much more intense development. We looked at an alternative that would be somewhat higher, somewhere up around 4 million square feet, which would be somewhere near the low end of the typical transit-oriented projects that are being built in the Bay Area. And what you see in terms of the densities in the developer-sponsored plan and the community-prepared plan, the DSP and the CPP scenarios, those are pretty typical and maybe even average to a little bit below average of some of the transit-oriented development you're now seeing in the Bay Area.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the transit-oriented development, particularly San Francisco and what you're going to start seeing in San Jose and Milpitas in and around the BART extension is going to be far more intense than even the Baylands proposal.
Okay. One of the questions that was brought up was, and you had talked about it, were the different intersections. No matter what plan gets developed, that the 14 of the 18 intersections are going to fail to meet the general plan levels. So, granted, the general plan was created in the 90s. We have a much different situation today. When this was analyzed, the train station was basically the train station, not a multimodal station, where all the different modes of transportation go into, say, one hub.
You're talking about the 1994?
Well,
traffic
I definitely know that the 1994 wasn't looking at a multimodal station.
Right.
These standards were created then, but we still have to work within those standards because that's what's in the general plan today. Unless we amend the general plan, that's what we have to work within. If a multimodal station was created that had these different modes of transportation that would be easily accessible to people who would live and work around the area, is there potential for then these reductions to be reduced because now public transportation is much more accessible than what currently exists today?
The traffic studies done in the EIR do assume what's called a modal split between modes. So there is an allocation to transit use, bicycle use, pedestrian use. It's not very high in terms of transit use. We looked at, and the final EIR does look at how would you go about increasing use of transit, and there are ways of doing that, of enhancing transit. The other thing going on, it was mentioned earlier in the public hearings, I think in our traffic evening, is a change in the way CEQA is going to be looking at traffic and transportation. And basically really pushing transit orientation, reducing trip generation, and increasing use of bicycles and other modes of transportation, rather than aiming as the first shot at mitigation, adding more roadway. And so in some cases, and there are cities, I use a Southern California example, where the city of Santa Monica is having some real problems in and around their downtown, and they finally said, we are not going to try and fix some of the intersections leading into the downtown, because fixing those intersections just throws more traffic, and we're never going to build our way out of a traffic problem. And so that is one of the things that SB 743, which is that law, is pushing towards. On the other hand, so there's a couple ways of looking at that traffic congestion issue that you face in this city. And the developer-sponsored plan, the community-prepared plan, basically, they don't say this expressly, but that traffic congestion is an inherent part of what you're going to face. There's no fixing it. You can end up with a 10, 12 lane Bayshore Boulevard. All you got to do is knock down everything on both sides. So you aren't going to get there. And the push is then to get more transit orientation, and that's what you see as the direction that Plan Bay area is going. We're not going to fix some of these traffic problems. The Planning Commission looked at the very same issue and wrestled with that question of, we can't fix the traffic. We know that, and their response to transit orientation was to say, we're probably better off, and this is the commission saying it, just minimizing the amount of development that's put out there. And so they had just a very different response. As opposed to trying to really maximize transit use, they minimize development. And so there's no right way here.
No, it's just a perspective.
It's a perspective, and it's what is important to you as a community, what is the character of land use you want to see out there, because congestion is going to occur either way. It's all, how do you want to manage it?
Okay. And then I have some questions in regards to the school study, even though we did have a fairly testy meeting about it at our last meeting. But, having a high school is a land use. Both the DSP and the CPP have a high school in those plans, and so I have some questions, related to that. So we have this high school component in these two plans. What was the motivation to put a high school in the plans. This is before I was on the council. And Clark, you being on the council, you probably were.
Well, my recollection is that as part of the land use, the exercises that went forward with developing that community plan for study in the EIR, that was identified at Charter High School, was identified as a desirable land use at the time. Again, that was close to 8 years ago now. So, that may or may not have the same resonance that it did back then, but that's why it was included. And my recollection is the developer included it as well because they perceived it to be considered a community desire at the time.
Okay.
That's when the parent group that pushed the charter high school was kind of pushing that, so.
Okay, so it was coming from the community. The community said, hey, as part of our alternative plan, we'd like to see this as a benefit. But it's not required, but it's just one of those benefits that you would negotiate during the development agreement. Okay. So both plans have a high school in the Baylands, but does the high school have to be in the Baylands? Could it be at some other location in Brisbane?
Yeah.
Again, there's no requirement for a high school. It's not a mitigation for anything. It's not a condition of this project. So again, if it's truly a land use choice for the council to make, whether included or not included.
But even if we designated a high school land area, it doesn't mean that the school district would want or need it.
Correct, or could get approval for it.
Sure. But if you say you did a study, the study could evaluate potential other sites besides the Baylands. I mean, could that be part of the study that could be evaluated?
I mean, it's something that could be evaluated. My suggestion would be if you're looking for a local high school site, that be done in conjunction with the high school district.
Yes, no, absolutely.
Yeah. And because ultimately they have to make that decision, and the rules for charter high schools are slightly different. I'm not that certain on the charter school, but it would be something that would make sense to do if a local high school were an important thing to work with the school district to get one.
Okay. Let's see. Because of the obligations to the former RDA, when would you anticipate any of the schools that are in that area to receive funding from development? More than a significant amount of money. I mean, I guess they get some right now, but it's not a lot.
Yeah, that I don't know. We'll have to-
I'll take a shot at it. I think this question's come up a few different times during the process. So right now, we are scheduled to pay off our bonds in RDA 2, which is where the Baylands is, in 2027. We have some other debt also, but we anticipate around 2027 that debt will be paid off as is right now. Now, if you have development out there, then that date could be sped up a little bit. But realistically, even if you decided in 2017 that you wanted to adopt new general plan guidance and developer then wanted to pursue that, you're probably talking 22, 23 before you'd have anything on the tax rolls. So the speeding up from the 27 date is probably, maybe a year, maybe 2 at the most. And then basically the way it works now is they are getting some revenue, but when the bonds are paid off, we will all get more revenue, all the underlying tax entities.
Okay. When the superintendent of Bayshore came before the council, she had indicated that there wasn't any real outreach to her. You talked about everyone was on board, Clark, and she kind kind of flew off the handle in regards to that. But I know that you had reached out to her, Clay, and it mentioned about the study and that, the high school component was part of the Baylands, some of the plans. And what was your conversation with her?
I'm beginning to feel a little bit like James Comey here.
Yeah.
I had, as I believe I indicated in the staff report, I had contacted each of the three superintendents. I had met in person with each of the three superintendents to indicate to them that there was, two council subcommittees that had looked at the idea of doing a study. We had talked to the property owner that they were agreeable to paying for a both legal and financial review of various potential options. Obviously, because you're trying to gather information, you're not asking anybody what their opinion about what the study would be or results would be or where you would go with it. So there was no conversation about that. But we had what I would characterize as a professional and good conversation about it. I think what you heard last night or last week was just, they have come to a opinion about whatever the conclusion of that study might be.
Okay.
But we are going to be having a meeting with the Bayshore School District, their trustees. We're going to have a subcommittee meeting, and I did get an email from the superintendent following the last council meeting saying that she was willing to help us set up a meeting.
Okay.
So it sounded like her tone was a little more conciliatory as the follow-up.
So I did get a comment from a member of the Brisbane School Board who also was a little disconcerted that this hadn't been brought to their board and felt that it really should before a study was undertaken on their behalf, not just the superintendent, but that they thought it should go to the school board.
The Brisbane
discussed.
School District?
Mm-hmm.
We did
Brisbane.
meet with their subcommittee as well.
I also got a comment from 2 board members as well, kind of disappointed in us. So I don't know if that's really I don't know if we really should be talking about that
Probably not.
No.
now, but that's all I want to say.
Okay.
All right.
Any further questions?
No, I don't.
Okay. Great. So I have a few questions. On page 11 of the staff report, the May 4th staff report, it talks about how we have the option of establishing a maximum square footage for both the entire Baylands as well as the sub-areas.
The page on that?
Page 11. And the staff report talks about the pros and cons of each approach and what the planning commission did, which was to establish a maximum square footage or floor area ratio for both the entire Baylands as well as a requirement. They recommended a requirement that a specific plan allocate development intensity among each of the development areas that are proposed in the specific plan. So how can you tell us if you know what approach has been taken in, say, the Slate Lock development or Hunters Point or other recent developments in the Bay Area, whether they've gone with the specific or just the overall floor area ratio requirement?
The typical,
What's
I think almost anywhere, is that there would be a basic development standard, intensity standard that would be applied to whole properties,
Right.
and then a specific plan would lay out the internal layout. And the reason for that is, at a general plan level, it's just too difficult to try and outguess the internal design of a development.
Okay, so it's more common than to have just the maximum floor area ratio for the entire development and allow the specific plan to look at each sub-area and without having a requirement
Yeah.
for each sub-area.
Yeah, the typical general plan will lay out so that you can determine what is the maximum amount of development allowed on individual pieces of property, even large properties, and then the actual development of an individual property would lay out how that would be distributed within a site.
Thank you. And then towards the end of the staff report on page 18, it talks about Plan Bay Area. And I wanted to see if there's any updates on that that would be applicable to this project. Or what, how that,
The current draft of Plan Bay Area, the preferred scenario, does allocate 4,400 units to this PDA area. That
Okay.
would essentially mean something very much along the lines of what the developer's proposal was. And again, the city had commented on the preliminary version, objected to that number, again, because we are in our planning process. MPC ABAG chose not to change their proposed plan. So that's the number in the scenario that's now called the preferred scenario. I think there's an EIR has been published. I think the city will have one more opportunity to comment through about the middle of June on that document. But the preferred shows the 4,400.
okay. And what impact or requirement does that then place on the council in the land use planning? if
Well, I think
any?
there are a couple of things from a practical standpoint. This particular housing arena numbers, regional housing needs allocations are tied to Plan Bay Area. However, this particular Plan Bay Area, the increment of time it covers, will not drive the next housing element. So there'll be one more update of Plan Bay Area that will then establish our RENA allocation for the 2022 housing element. But obviously, if there's a 4,000 unit and that carried forward to the next Plan Bay Area, then it would be likely you parse that 4,400 units, that would probably be a RENA allocation of 800 and some odd units for that next 7-year cycle. But that's kind of reading tea leaves. None of that's, that's not cast in concrete or fixed in stone.
Sure. So it also says in the staff report that it says it talks about Parkside and how that's going to add 230 dwelling units. But that the only way for the projections under Plan Bay Area to be met would be to include a substantial residential component in the Baylands. So does that mean that if we allowed housing, that it would allow us to satisfy the RENA numbers in the current cycle?
We'd more than
We'd more than
satisfy the
satisfy,
current.
depending on what
numbers,
was
which were only
approved.
288. That was,
Right. It says substantial residential component, but it's, I think, what was it, 283 units, or what was the number that was?
I think it was 286.
Something like that. So it's only like 50
Yeah.
unit difference.
Yeah, we would, the goal of Parkside is to achieve that's our obligation under until 2022. If we achieve that, we will be current with our RENA, and whatever happens in the future, happens in the future, and
Okay.
deal with it.
As a follow-up for that, if I may, Plan Bay Area, if that, the update goes through and they label us with 4,400 units, if we don't have an area that is zoned for it, they cannot force us to change our zoning.
Well, again, there's the driver, the link is, let's fast forward and say, in the next Plan Bay Area 2021, that number carries forward, 4,400 units for Brisbane. Let's say we don't have any excess, we didn't create any other housing sites in the interim, so that 4,400 units, our regional housing needs allocation would likely be an increment of that 4,400. So we would be getting a RENA allocation to tell that in your housing element, you need to designate sites for 850 units for that next RENA cycle, which would be 2022 to 2028 or whatever, 2029.
2030.
2038 years, yeah. So to 2030, you'd have to have whatever that allocation is, whether it's 800 or 1,000. And that would be our obligation. So again, to have a housing element that complies with our state obligations, we would need to come up with sites to accommodate that RENA allocation. I think as we've talked about before, the implications of not achieving your RENA allocations are, it seems like it somewhat changes over time in terms of what is the ramifications or the implications of the city of not achieving our RENA for the housing.
Right. So the RENA allocations require us to zone, but not necessarily to build. So my next question was, can you give us an update on what's being proposed in the state legislature in terms of housing bills that could potentially impact our planning for the Baylands?
There's a lot of pending legislation, and in terms of how it might affect, I think there's a lot of work to be done in the legislation that's out there, unless Clay has something more.
Well, I did send, I think last Friday, the latest update from our consultant.
Right.
And I've actually got a phone call with them tomorrow afternoon, so I'll be talking to them, and I will forward on to you kind of the status.
Okay.
What I did hear from them yesterday is that things are starting to heat up in Sacramento, not the weather, but the politics around housing. And so, where this particular legislature goes with that, we're monitoring it the best we can.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. I don't have any further questions. Is there anything else council wants to ask at this point?
I wanted to follow up on something,
Oh,
the
sure.
area that you were in, in regards to, PDA. So the Baylands is part of a bi-county PDA. When was that established?
Probably about 2008, maybe, ballpark, 7 or 8.
All right. And was that something that the city wanted to be a part of, or it was created that way and we were just
No,
part
the
of it?
city, it was made very clear that the city, when the city made the PDA application, was not committing to housing. There was no authorization, no general plan authorization to allow for housing in the PDA boundaries, which were essentially the Baylands property. And they understood at that point that the city was considering an application for housing, and then city would be considering that application. City's point of view at that point was that PDA is a priority development area with a mix of housing and employment function that way, irrespective of how maybe the pieces will be arranged. You'd certainly have jobs and housing in proximity to transit. I think what has changed here is the sort of the emphasis on numbers and housing production, which clearly is a higher emphasis than it was when the PDA. I mean, if the city had been obligated at that point to say, yes, you will need to commit to filling the number of housing units, I think we all know where that PDA would have gone.
Sure. Yeah, and I was, maybe I'm not reading it correctly, but I always thought that the bi-county area of the PDA for San Francisco was just the Slate-Lock site, but it goes all the way up into Visitation Valley, Little Hollywood, Executive Park. So it's a much larger PDA. Okay, and then the San Francisco side of the PDA, I mean, are they relying on the train station, being a multimodal station to provide mitigation for their traffic generation?
I know there are a number of improvements that were proposed both to the station, to the BRT, Bus Rapid Transit, as well as the connection with the Muni line. I think maybe we're kind of mixing things here. The PDA, the idea of the PDA application and its designation was to actually make the city or any city more competitive for funding for those kind of transit
yeah.
improvements. So whether or not those were actually identified in the various EIRs in Schlag or Hunters Point as mitigation, I'm not really sure of that.
All right. Yeah, I mean, it just seems like, with all that development that's happening out in San Francisco, without, some kind of like really grand vision for moving people around. I mean, I know they have the BRTs and going through some of the existing neighborhoods, but it just, I don't know, it just doesn't seem like enough. And it just seems like it's going to create just a huge headache with traffic because not having the right transportation infrastructure in place. So.
I mean, there were in all of those EIRs, there were an assumed modal split, there were assumed improvements to transit. And so the actual modal splits for use of transit in the San Francisco projects were higher than what was used in the Baylands.
Okay. All right. I guess we'll see.
All right. Anything further? I saw that we did receive one slip, but we usually take public comment during the regular council meeting. That's for later? Okay, perfect. Okay.
I know Jonathan was about ready to jump out of
Is
his
it-
chair there because he's going to karaoke for us or something.
Okay, so then with that, we will adjourn until our regular council meeting at 7:30, and the public will have a chance to comment at that point. Thank you.